See if this experience sounds familiar. You're watching a guitar player, and their fingers seem to be moving in patterns that look and sound completely different from anything you're capable of doing. For me, whenever I see this, it leaves me feeling like I've missed something big, something formative. Like that day I skipped geometry class, I came back the next day, I had no idea what was going on. Welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. Today you will learn to sequence scales the Oz Noy way. Now we'll get to who Oz Noy is in a second, but scale sequencing is like that day we skipped geometry class, right? There's something important about it. It's valuable information, and if you skip over it, you miss a chance to build a core capability. Now it turns out that scale sequencing is not a hard thing to understand. It's actually a very easy process, but it's not easy to find physical success early on if you haven't done this. And admittedly, as guitar players, we often sacrifice the hard work for just playing the stuff we already know how to do. Oz Noy is a popular jazz fusion guitar player out of New York City. He's originally from Israel. If you haven't heard of him, you should look him up. Anyway, recently a video came out featuring Oz Noy talking about practicing and tips for a good practice routine. I'll link that video in the description below. Well, in this video, Oz is describing and talking about and demonstrating scale sequencing, and he basically blasts through some beautiful patterns very nonchalantly. Well, this video made the rounds on my teaching platform called The Studio and generated a lot of interest and a lot of discussion, so I tabbed out all those exercises. But I wanted to get the idea of scale sequencing in front of a larger audience because I think it's one of those things that we often overlook that actually turns out to be super valuable. Okay, let's zoom in. I'm going to show you how to sequence scales directly on the fretboard, and I'll explain why they're so valuable. Here we go. Let me just give you a demonstration first. In the video that I linked for Oz Noy, he's using this C major scale. This is basically a 2-octave C major scale. Here's our first octave. And here's our second octave. Those are the only notes I'm going to be playing, but let me just show you a couple of sequences. And again, sequencing is just changing the sequence of the notes we're playing. So instead of playing them every note in a row, we're going to change the sequence of the notes, but we're not going to change the notes we're playing. It's going to be changing the sequence. Here's one that Oz Noy calls jumping thirds. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but my hands are moving in a different way. When I change the sequence of notes is different, the order of notes is different, it sounds different, and it fingers different. Here's another one called jumping fourths. Right? Same exact notes, I'm just changing the sequence, and so everything changes. The sound is changing, the fingering is changing. Let me explain what's going on here. So we're going to use that second example, the example that sequences in fourths, in the interval of a fourth. I'm going to use 1 octave of the scale, and let me show you how to engineer the sequence, right? So instead of playing linearly, we're going to use this sequence of a fourth, right? We're going to be moving in fourths, and let me show you what that means. So here's my first note. Now we just find the note that's 4 notes away in the scale. There it is, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So my sequence looks like this. Right? Now I'm going to go to the next note in the scale. I've done the first one. That's my sequence. Now I'm going to go to the next note in the scale and repeat the sequence. I'm going to start here, find the note that's a fourth away. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's my second sequence. I'm going to go back and stitch them together. Right? Third note in the scale is here, right? 1, 2, 3. It's the next one. I got to build my sequence here. From this note, 4 notes up is 1, 2, 3, 4. There it is again. The same pattern is showing itself, right? The pattern I'm seeing is that I'm playing the note on the same fret, just on the next string. Right? Which makes sense because the guitar is actually tuned in fourths. We've got our E string and our A string. E, F, G, A. That's 4 notes away. Here's our A string. The one right across it on the nut is the D string. A, B, C, D. We're moving in fourths, right? So when I stack this scale in fourths, it makes sense now. This pattern is starting to make sense to me, right? Watch what happens when I start the same sequence on the fourth note of the scale. This is our parent scale, our C major scale, the fourth note up, 1, 2, 3, 4. When I start the pattern here, and I build the sequence off the fourth note, watch what happens. 1, 2, 3, 4. The shape changes, right? This is still a fourth, but this interval is called an augmented fourth. It's got a different sound to it, right? But it's dictated by the scale. In other words, when I start the sequence of a fourth from here, in the C major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, I have to play this note. So far, that's the only place it's changed. I'm going to go back to the beginning and just make sure I've got each one of these sequences stitched together. Next note in the scale is the fifth note of the scale. Just simply move up from there 4 notes to get my sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've returned to same fret, just skipping strings, right? And I've ended on the root, so I've got my fourths are done. Watch. Right? I'm starting to feel what it sounds like to make these sounds, right? My ears and my hands are starting to sort of get collaborative and start to program what this sounds and feels like to me. Now it behooves you to do stuff like play this backwards. Right? Start to really get the sound under your fingers and really understand how the pattern is working. Move it up and back. Let me show you another one. We're going to go back and we're going to do thirds. Instead of moving up 4 notes from our starting point, we're only going to move up 3. Here's our first note in the scale. Building the sequence by looking for that third note simply looks like this. 1, 2, 3. Right? So here's my first note, second note. I've just built the sequence. I've just moved up the scale in a third, right? Using the interval of a third, picking the third note away. I'm going to go to the next note in the scale, do the same thing. 1, 2, 3, right? Here's what the sequence looks like. I'm going to stitch those two together. When I get to this third note, watch what happens. Going up 3 notes from here makes this sequence 2 notes per string here. Stitching them all together. Right? That's a different fingering, right? I'm solving problems as I go to keep this sequence intact. Going to the fourth note now. Going up 3 notes. And back to this 1 note per string idea. Stitching them all together. Next note in the scale is this one. There's 3 notes above it. When I go to this note, 3 notes above this one is again 2 notes per string. Stitching them all together. Here's my next note in the scale. 3 notes from there. And then I return to the octave. So here's my full sequence in thirds, and just watch how my fingering is changing. You can do this one backwards as well. Now sequences like this have been used for centuries on any instrument, just to get your fingers and your ears moving in new ways, to produce something more interesting than just going up and down a scale. When you move through these scales like this, using these new sequences, you create interesting intervallic ideas. It sounds more interesting. And once you sit down with this idea and you really program a few of these in, your ears and your hands start to get connected and they're able to program themselves to make these sounds. This produces more versatile capability whenever you play any scale. Okay, there it is. The real value in scale sequencing is actually not the sequences themselves, but the act of training your hands to move in different ways and make different sounds. And you end up with a broader catalog of capabilities. This makes you a more versatile musician. And I don't know about you, but I think being a more versatile musician is always a good thing to strive for. Tabs for this video, as well as all of the videos on this channel, are available through my Patreon page, as well as a ton of other content. If you'd like to support the channel, I thank you in advance. I hope this lesson has been interesting for you. I hope it's generated some new thought about how to sequence scales, why that's so important. As always, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.